Hello, and thank you so much for watching today. I'm really excited about this topic and our guests. We've got Stephen Walker from Calgary Counseling Center and Alex Sarian, the president and CEO of Arts Commons. Thanks so much for being here, guys.
Thanks for having us.
So, when dealing with our mental health and emotional well-being, it's really important to have a lot of tools and strategies to cope. And one of the tools that can be really beneficial for our mental health is creative expression. Whether that's painting or drawing or making music or whatever that may be, that can be, a really helpful tool when we're struggling. So we're going to talk about how creating and consuming art can support your mental health. So to start off, guys, can you just tell us a bit about yourself and the role that art plays in your life?
Stephen, do you want to go first?
All right. Since you asked, I'm Stephen Walker. I'm a counselor. I'm a registered clinical social worker. I work with Calgary Counseling Center, and the role that art plays in my life is it creates opportunities for me. So when I'm engaged in art, whether it's drawing in my case, or reading some really creative graphic novels, or really just finding my way to an art gallery like the Van Gogh exhibit we just had in town not too long ago. What art does for me is it introduces new ways of thinking about myself, new ways of thinking about the world I'm in that I might not arrive at just simply going through the regular day-to-day flow of my working, living, parenting sort of day. When I'm drawing at any moment, I might be, frustrated by something or learn something about myself, or, maybe where I need to learn some more, or when I'm staring into a painting, I might see an expression of something I'm unfamiliar with. It might touch me in a way and cause me to feel things that are unfamiliar to me. And all these things add to me. And so when I encounter difficulties in my life or different challenges that I'm not sure how to face, my connection with art often creates a lot of flexibility, a lot of different avenues, things that I may not think about doing or considering even doing, other than because, these ideas, these thoughts, these feelings were introduced to me through my relationship with art.
Excellent. And how about you, Alex?
Well, there are a couple of different ways to answer that question for me. On the one hand, it's my job and I live in this world, so I'm part of the creative workforce in Calgary, which I'm very proud of. It's an amazing community. So I see the arts as a vehicle for employment and economic development and all the things that come with being part of a workforce. But when I think about my first connection with the arts, so I was raised in Argentina. I grew up there as a kid. And in the 80s and 90s, in what I would call a fairly traditional Catholic conservative country, if you weren't going to become a doctor, an engineer, a business person, then there was something wrong with you. And when I reflect on my time in elementary and middle school and high school, I wasn't a traditional student. Like I didn't succeed in the way the young people were expected to succeed. I was a fairly average student. And it wasn't until I found theater and music in early high school that I found my people and I found my tribe and I found myself, and I fell in love with education and I fell in love with being at school because it was around building community, and that actually led to a career in arts education for a long time. Unlike Stephen, I'm not a mental health practitioner, so I want to be very clear. I love the arts. I love its impact on social and emotional well-being. I recognize that there are tangential ways of engaging, whether it's arts education or art therapy. There are different ways this conversation can go. But I fell in love with education because as a young person, it allowed me to feel and experience success and experience community in a way that allowed me to lean into my education, in a way that allowed me to lean in to my youth development is now a big phrase. And I think so much of that is allowing young people to find what they're good at, so that they can lean into it as a career path, as a way of developing oneself, as opposed to spending these pivotal years of your life feeling like you don't belong.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, my first exposure to the arts wasn't necessarily because I wanted to become or work in the arts or become an artist. It had this moment where I found myself and what I wanted. And so that's why my career in arts education has been about being able to provide that for other young people. And I think now in my role at Arts Commons, I've amplified that a lot. So it's how do we provide these opportunities through and for the arts for people and students of any age to come together, find themselves. And so I as much as I live in this world from a business perspective, it's really the social and emotional impact that the arts has on people that I think makes us so unique. And there's an urgency to exposing people to the arts in very organic and just holistic ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Alex, you said that you're not a mental health professional, but I mean, you certainly don't need to be to see how art
Mhm.
plays a role in our mental health. Like you said, it can shape part of your identity and can build that community. So, I mean, Stephen, let's get your thoughts on this. Like, what role do you see playing in supporting mental health?
Well, I mean, art fundamentally is a form of expression and a kind of dialogue that happens both between the person observing the art and themselves and the artist in creating the work or learning about themselves. And so, as a process, as an experience, art really helps one acknowledge oneself and one's own experiences, whether you like it or not sometimes. And one of the really common factors in a lot of mental health issues, one of the ways that we differentiate or we separate something we would call a mental health issue from a normal life struggle, like a regular life difficulty, is the repetitiveness of it. It's, in a sense, like when you're treading the same ground, thinking about your childhood misfortunes or in your mind, or whether you're kind of living the way you live in your marriage, the way you have. It's a lot of what forms the kind of issues we face that we call mental health issues are repetitive in nature, and art has a really disruptive effect on some of these patterns. Like when you're staring into a painting or watching a play where somebody is really just pouring their heart out, expressing how powerless they feel or perhaps how empowered they feel in whatever circumstance, we can't help but relate to those circumstances or what's being presented to us. And it creates alternatives potentially. It creates other thoughts, other ideas, other passions and feelings, other ways of looking at the world. And so with that, there's opportunity. And so art is an opportunity to be flexible, to approach things in new ways, even subtly in small incremental ways. And so depending on which type of art we're referring to, I mean, there's so much opportunity there. I think of the performing arts, Alex, which you're involved in, but like visual arts, musical arts, like, we're talking about treading a lot of ground with that word. But
For sure.
that I would say is kind of the synthesis of where I see a key intersection. And I think Alex speaks so eloquently to the idea of community as well. Art is rarely expressed in isolation.
Yeah.
And so you find your tribe looking at the things you need to see. There are people like you who need similar things, who are seeking similar things in that gallery, in that show. And so we tend to find the people we need in that context as well.
Alex, what do you think? Like, how do you see art? And again, we're saying that that's a really broad thing. How do you see it in your role, playing a part in mental health, whether it's yourself or the people around you?
Well, I think and Stephen mentioned it beautifully, it's really about being in dialogue. And one of the things that I really appreciate around the art of, or the exercise of sharing art, because it is a social exercise, is that there's a beautiful tension. And right now there's this tendency to avoid tension. And we can talk more about that later. And one of the outcomes of avoiding tension is that we all sort of retreat into ourselves, or back into our biases. And so there's this very healthy medium through which we're expressing tension. And one of the questions I always ask an artist, and it's a fake question because it's meant to like trick them out, but the question I always ask is, what's more important? Is it the intent of the artist or the perception of the audience? And there's no one right answer to that question, but what it does, it highlights this, even though I'm sitting in a theater seemingly passively, I'm not. It's the way that I the way that I consume art, the way that I interpret it, the way that I create meaning out of it, that dialogue is truly what brings us together, whether
Mhm.
it's between me and the artist or whether it's between me and the person sitting next to me in the audience. It's this collaborative effort. And there's one, the closest I ever got to practicing or engaging in a sort of artistic medium through the lens of mental health was working with um, an incredible expert who passed away recently called Augusto Boal. He's Brazilian, and he was the creator of a genre of theater called theater of the oppressed. And for those of you that don't know him, I would encourage you to read all his books. It's beautiful. He's Brazilian, and he brought theater making to communities that were struggling. And his premise was, how you have traditionally you have the actor and the spectator. He created this concept called the spectactor. And forum theater is a genre of theater by which you have actors on stage play out a scenario in which the protagonist has many different choices to make along the way. And you essentially, as an audience, you watch the protagonist fail, or you watch the protagonist make a series of choices that lead to his oppression. And then what happens is you have you have somebody called the Joker, who's like the MC of the show, and he or she engages the audience in asking them, what choices would you have made differently? What allies would you have leaned into? So given the world of the theater, he invites the spectators into the world of the theater, and and essentially the actors who need to be very good at improvising essentially start playing out the recommendations of the audience to see what the outcome of any given choice is. And when you read about Augusto Boal or when you hear him talk, he says, the arts shouldn't just be a reflection that is being held back up to us. Um, it needs to be a hammer with which we shape reality. And if you can go into the reflection and change the reflection, then you're more likely able to change the reality. So it's this really beautiful and powerful way of holding this reflection of humanity up to oneself. And it's up to us if we want to just sit there and take it, or if we want to move into that world and help change it. And so theater of the oppressed is something that I think was, and to a certain degree, we all go through that exercise. And when we talk about consumption of arts and culture, there's such a big difference between consuming it in community versus what we've been doing for the past 2 years, which is sitting in our living room binge watching TV by oneself. And so the irony there is, and Stephen and I were talking about this just a few months ago. The irony is that we've been consuming record amounts of arts and culture throughout the pandemic, but the
Mhm.
irony is we've not been doing it in community. So I think for the first time in the history of my career, I felt like the consumption of arts and culture in isolation is actually doing more harm than good.
Really? How so?
Well, and Stephen, I mean, I've been quoting you since I met you, but this idea that and I'm gonna butcher your phrase, but you say something beautifully to the effect of, when we consume something in isolation, we're essentially reinforcing our own biases. I'll turn it over to you.
Norm referencing. Yeah, it's kind of, yeah, like we always have to decide what things mean. We're meaning machines. And so when I consume art in isolation, it's what I see, what I feel, what I hear is a reflection of me through the art, through the medium of that art or that expression, and frankly says more about me and what I value and what I'm inspired by or not, than really whatever the art represents. And so when I consume that in isolation and I reflect on that, there's things I learn about myself, but I amplify those things. I reinforce those things, for good or for ill, or other ways of looking at that. But when I consume art in the community, right, with friends, like, for example, if I'm with a friend who's Indigenous, and they're experiencing the same thing, what do they notice? What have they experienced? What do they take? What do they see? And something that I thought was inspiring and inspired, maybe to them was just a reminder of some deep hurt, or maybe of something else entirely. And so now my horizons have broadened. Now my norm reference has expanded in some way, to include not only my own feelings and thoughts and views on the world, but elements of my friends as well, or others who are around me. And so then in that manner, I expand, and perhaps even begin to change.
Stephen, at certain points, can't it be beneficial to take in art on our own?
Yeah, it really depends what you're trying to accomplish, I think. and they see Alex is all over this. It really depends on your intention. Like his question, it's kind of like a setup, like that there's so many right answers to that question. So from a therapy perspective, a correct answer, an example of a correct answer is, I'm not sure what to do with my life. I'm not sure. I'm directionless. I'm middle-aged, let's say, and I'm not thrilled with my career anymore, the status of my life, but I need inspiration. I want to find something I want, something I want to drive towards, not something I want to avoid. So how do I learn that about myself? How do I learn what those things are? Well, consuming art privately and experiencing these different things and listening for those tones, those intonations of inspiration could be a great way to develop that insight. Whereas if I need to change, though, if I need to become different in some way, I need new perspective. I need to, I'm just treading that same old ground of how helpless and powerless I am in my head. I need to do something different in here. Well, then I might want to consume art in company, because then rather than sort of just constantly see the reflection of my own depressed thoughts revealed back to me, I'm going to hear these other people describe their experiences, and their experiences can now be added to my own. And in doing so, I'm treading new ground. And maybe that begins to help me change in the ways that I'm seeking to change.
Right.
And piggybacking off that, it's a spectrum, right? It's not one or the other. So, for example, I think to myself, if I don't want to be, little secret about me, I hate crowds. Right. So the thought, like, if I'm not in the mood to be around 1,000 people, I really don't want to be. But I could take myself to a gallery. I could take myself to a museum. I could take myself outside of my comfort zone, where my experience is being crafted by somebody else. So I'm outside of that comfort zone. I'm relinquishing some of that power, but still I'm in a gallery or a museum where the social interaction is very different than being in a concert hall with 2,000 people. So it's not, there's no one right way of consuming things. And going back to Stephen's point, I think it's that when I'm in control of what I want to see, I'm very much leaning into what is comfortable, what is historically made me who I am.
Right.
Whereas if I know, like, if I go to the Glenbow Museum or if I go to Contemporary Calgary, both incredible institutions where I trust that they're going to craft an experience that is stunning, but I don't know what's in it. So it's, I'll give you an example. There's a beautiful exhibit by the Glenbow at their temporary pop-up at the Edison called Here to Tell, which is about Alberta's connection to Holocaust survivors. And it's like, I didn't know what to expect, but I was the only person, it was the only person there. And it was this deeply moving and challenging experience that I would not have been able to had I just stayed at home and watched TV.
Beautiful example.
So, guys, when we talk about art and whether, like, again, the whole spectrum, whether that's making music or acting or painting, drawing, whatever, I think a lot of people think that it's only worth doing if you are excelling at it, if you're good at it, if you consider yourself an artist. Talk about that.
I should show you my drawings, but I'm not going to do that. I think my response to that, and I'd love to hear Alex's as well, is there's the difference between process and product.
Yeah.
And definitely when the purpose of the expression is precision, then okay, I get it, right? But if the purpose is insight, if the purpose is learning, if the purpose is to be challenged, is to learn something new or be exposed to something new, then the product is only the result, not the reason. It's kind of like, imagine going to a play and things go not according to plan, not according to script. Those are some of the most amazing, memorable moments in theater, both for the people watching as well for the actors themselves. And that forms part of this delicious, amazing, insightful experience that frankly can't be repeated usually. But also similarly, when I draw, I don't often end up with the drawing that I thought I was going to end up with, or the way that I thought I was. And in doing so, I learn things about myself. There's things I learn about my limitations, perhaps, things I learn about my expectations, what I thought was going to happen versus what ended up happening. But yeah, process is a different piece of that. So Alex, please.
Oh, I love that. Well, so I think historically in the arts world, um, people they say, product over process or process and you can't. Those are not mutually exclusive. And to Stephen's point, a strong process leads to a strong product. Um, the way that I would explain it to, when I was teaching, I would start all my classes with young people with this. It's a stupid joke, but it's three artists walk into a bar, and you have a talented artist, you have an interpretive artist, and you have a creative artist. And those three to me live on a spectrum. A talented artist could be technically savvy but not necessarily know how to create anything. And so to me, the ultimate goal of an artist, I think the ultimate goal of people, and I think artists just exemplify this, but the ultimate goal of people and artists is to create meaning where there was none. And you train and you acquire talent and you become talented so that you can get better at creating meaning, whether it's through dance, through music, through, brush. And so I would say that to young people because oftentimes I would hear, young, incredibly talented people that were happy replicating somebody else's song or that were happy replicating somebody else's monologue. And I was like, that's great. You are proving that you have talent. What are you going to do with it now? And so the reason I use talented, interpretive, and creative as three benchmarks of a spectrum is because you're moving from being talented into creating meaning. And interpretive, right? So the example I always give with interpretive is if you're doing Hamlet, but you're setting it in like Nazi Germany, you are creating some sort of meaning by using a new context, by putting this text in a new context. You are creating new meaning out of it, as opposed to the ultimate expression of creation, which is creating a new play or writing a new play or writing a song. So to me, it's how, why are you doing what you're doing? And I think I shared this example when Stephen and I were on a panel, but I remember I was in Singapore consulting with their local board of education, and they were parading me around these IB art students. And I was walking around these classrooms, and on the wall were probably some of the most stunning works of art I had ever seen. And the students were standing next to them. And I remember asking these young adults, I said, please tell me about your process. Tell me about why you did what you did. And they couldn't talk to me about it because it had been beaten into them that you needed to replicate and you needed to learn this technique, but not necessarily know why you were using it or how you were using it. And I somehow equate that to, over the past 10 years, this idea of conservatory training in music has been changing. Because historically, it used to be that to be a good musician, you needed to lock yourself in a room for 10 hours a day and practice your scales. And then you'd come out of there and you'd be a very good member of an orchestra. You'd know how to sight read, but do you know how to create music? Do you know how to write music? Do you know how to create something beautiful and put it into the world that wasn't there before? And so I think we have, even within the arts world, we have been questioning the intention behind why we do art. Why do people train in the art? And I think this idea of being technically savvy is no longer enough. I'd argue it was never enough. But so it's how do you create something that's never been done before? And the techniques by which you create something are different. There are people that create something that haven't spent a single day in art school, that create something beautiful. So I think the ultimate goal for me is how do you create something of meaning that wasn't there before? And whatever process you had to go through to get there, there's no one way.
Well, maybe to piggyback off how what you're describing, Alex, and just love listening to you speak about the arts, man, is how intentionality and are you thinking about what you're doing? Are you thinking about the process? Is the process connecting to the result you want? Because practicing your scales in the closet is a great way to join the orchestra, but not the great way to make jazz, right? But you might need to do both. You might need both processes. So one of the things that really formulates a lot of mental illness, like depression and anxiety and like all these different issues we face, is automaticity. So like the idea of kind of moving along, like this is just the way things are. This is just the way I am. This is just the way I act. And so a lot of mental illness expresses itself in automaticity and this kind of like robotic, kind of like I'm so predictable, And what the process that Alex is describing, how art can intersect with mental health, is shifting into a creative space where it's like with an emphasis on process before product, where it's like, okay, at the very least, I want to be different. Step one, I want to put something there that is not there currently. And step two is what process gets me there? What's the creative process? What's the skill, talent process? And this is where maybe counselors sometimes step in as like a comparative metaphor, as instructors or guides to what another person is practicing on their own. And then what ends up happening fundamentally, though, is growth.
Yeah.
Like it's growth. You're describing growth. Now, whether or not you end up playing for the Boston Orchestra or not is, that's the outcome. That's not the process.
And the irony is also that we're also guilty of it in the arts world. Like the amount of young people that get turned off from the arts because they had a piano teacher that told them they were doing it wrong, or like you're painting this wrong, or you're mixing colors wrong, and the arts world itself is very complicated in the sense that on the one hand you have people that embrace this creative messiness and the fact that there's no two paths that are the same, and then you have what used to be like pre-conservatory or conservatory training, in which there's a right way and a wrong way of doing it. So even within the arts world, we have been guilty of beating the creativity out of people.
I had a dear friend who once told me that there are no mistakes in art, and I liked that, and I was able to take that into my own creative processes and just think like whatever is put out there is how it was meant to be.
Yeah, one of the world's greatest economists, a New York City-based economist, said when he was asked what was the single greatest cause for his success, he said playing the cello, because your hands are working in complete opposite of one another. And he said that exercise allowed me to realize that I could hold divergent thoughts, and that there's no one answer to any one question. And he was like, it was just playing the cello that made me realize that I can do two things at once, and they can be like, and I can be pushing in the same direction.
Wonderful. The cello experience caused that expansion of awareness and understanding. Yeah. And I would say from a mental health perspective, what you're describing, I think, it's like being told, like you said, like everything has its place, as a son of immigrants, who really prized a traditional form of education, that I found a particularly difficult lesson to learn, because it was very contradictory to what I'd been told and taught. And so part of how the art, and I think in mental health, intersect as well, is whatever type, form, or expression of art you're engaged in, right? Like you can't help but be influenced. Influence is the nature. You are being influenced. You are creating influence. And so if what you need is change, then art is a wonderful territory, a wonderful area to start exploring, to look for those influences.
Well, Alex and Stephen, I want to thank you so much for coming on here today. This has been an amazing talk. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and just as exciting as last time, Alex. Let's
do it again.
And thank you all for watching. I hope you have an excellent day.